Detective Sarah Mills stared at the empty display case in Mr. Richardson's study. The velvet-lined box, where his prized 1,856 British Guiana 1-cent magenta stamp should have been, now contained nothing but dust. "And you're certain you locked the case last night?" Sarah asked the elderly collector, who stood nervously twisting his bow tie. "Absolutely certain," Mr. Richardson replied. "I always check it 3 times before bed. It's my routine for 40 years. He gestured around the wood-paneled room, filled with display cases containing rare stamps from around the world. "But that stamp, that was my masterpiece." Sarah nodded, examining the lock. No signs of forced entry. The alarm system hadn't been triggered either. This was an inside job. "Who else has access to this room?" she asked, making notes in her small notebook. "Only my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who's been with me for 20 years, and my nephew Thomas, who's staying with me this month." Mr. Richardson sighed. "And of course, my new assistant James Cooper, who helps catalog the collection." Sarah walked around the study slowly. 3 suspects, all with means and opportunity. But who had the motive? "Tell me about the stamp's value," she said. $10 million at auction," Mr. Richardson replied. "But it's essentially worthless to steal. Everyone in the collector's world knows it's mine. No reputable buyer would touch it." "Interesting. So this wasn't about money." Sarah studied the room more carefully now. Something caught her eye, a small scuff mark on the hardwood floor near the window. "Fresh." "Mr. Richardson, does anyone in the house smoke?" He looked surprised by the question. "Only Thomas. But not in the house. I'm quite strict about that." Sarah pulled out her phone and called the station. "Mike, I need you to check something for me. The weather report from last night, between midnight and 6 a.m. While waiting, she interviewed the suspects one by one. Mrs. Chen was upset that anyone would suspect her after 20 years of loyal service. Thomas seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone. James Cooper was nervous but cooperative, showing her his detailed catalog records. Her phone buzzed. "Heavy rain all night," Mike reported. "Didn't let up until dawn." Sarah smiled. The pieces were falling into place. She gathered everyone in the study. "The missing stamp is worth millions," she began, "but this theft wasn't about money. It was about something else entirely." She turned to Thomas. "You've been checking your phone constantly. Waiting for news about your gambling debts?" Thomas paled, but said nothing. "Here's what happened," Sarah continued. "You needed money badly. But you knew your uncle would never sell his precious stamp to help you. So you devised a plan. You'd steal it, then find it in James's apartment. Your uncle would fire him in disgrace, and out of gratitude, might be willing to help you with your financial troubles." "That's ridiculous," Thomas sputtered. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can. You forgot one detail. It rained heavily all night. But there's a fresh scuff mark by the window, made by someone climbing in. If it had been made during the rainy night, the wood would show water damage. This mark was made this morning, after the rain stopped. You climbed in through the window to make it look like a break-in, but you already had the stamp stolen using your own key while everyone was sleeping." Sarah walked to Thomas's jacket hanging by the door. "May I?" Without waiting for an answer, she reached into the pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the missing stamp, still in its protective case. Thomas slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry, Uncle. The casino threatened to break my legs. I was desperate." Mr. Richardson looked heartbroken. "If you had just come to me, the stamp will be returned to its rightful place," Sarah said firmly. As for you, Thomas, you'll need a good lawyer. As she left the house later, Sarah reflected that in her years as a detective, the hardest cases were always the ones involving family. The most valuable things in life, she had learned, weren't always the ones that could be displayed in a case or sold at auction. Sometimes the missing pieces that needed to be found weren't things at all, but trust, honesty, and forgiveness. She had solved the mystery of the missing stamp, but the deeper wounds it revealed in the Richardson family would take much longer to heal. Looking back at the magnificent house, Sarah saw Mr. Richardson carefully placing his recovered treasure back in its display case. Some pieces of a collection could be replaced, but the pieces of a broken family relationship were much harder to restore. That would be a mystery even she couldn't solve.